basically FDI inflows together with the emerging middle class are really the two most important growth drivers for Vietnam. So we really have to watch this a lot. I mean, in my firm as being private equity investors. And then on top of that, we also invest in both real estate and industrial parks, et cetera. And not to put in a plug for Savelos, but we found really fabulous information all the time from Savelos. So that we're really happy to participate in today's seminar. Okay, the key message for you today is that the FDI story in Vietnam has not changed at all, despite everything that happened, over the last year with the COVID and Delta and all that kind of stuff. What you can see on the screen here is that all of the growth drivers that have been always been pushing the. I'm sorry, guys, can you come down there? All the growth drivers that have been pushing the FDI story for all those years are still intact. Most of the things you can see on this screen are just, things that you probably self-explanatory. The geographic location, Vietnam is right in the middle of China and that the supply chains, et cetera. That having been said, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these. And then, of course, if there's any questions about what I've said, you can, in the Q&A, you can ask about that. So let me get a little bit more into the details on some of the points that I've put up on the slide here. Really, the most important thing is that factory wages in Vietnam are 2/3 below those in China. And the quality of the education in Vietnam, the quality of the workforce in Vietnam is basically comparable to what you would find in China, for example. And that's according to surveys from Jetro and others. This slide that I have on the screen, I have not actually updated it in a bit. First of all, because we've been very preoccupied with everything happening in COVID, those last 2 years, of course. And by the way, the other reason I haven't updated it is because the story has not changed at all. Guys, calm down. The story has not changed at all in Vietnam. The wage story is still there, the quality of the workforce, et cetera. Okay. The other thing that's really important to know is that the attractiveness of China as a production destination has really cratering now. And you've read all the stories about the regulatory clampdown in China, the power outages, all this kind of stuff. You've probably seen in the newspaper in the last couple of days that the Chinese have supposedly built some kind of mock-up of U.S. ships or some kind of crazy story like that. So you will see more and more hesitancy for companies to set up new factories in China. We'll see the extent to which companies move their production from China to Vietnam, but I think, and places like Vietnam, I should say. But I think we can be pretty assured that going forward, new production facilities are really going to be set up in Vietnam instead of in a place like China. There was some surveys by UBS and others that something like 20% of the factories in China are likely to leave in the next 10 years. We won't be able to absorb all of that in Vietnam, but we'll certainly get a good chunk of that. And so there's some headlines here on the screen. You can see recent headlines. I mean, literally in the last couple of weeks on this topic. I'm going to dig a little bit more into this whole topic about the relocation from China to Vietnam. And that, of course, very closely related topic to that is the U.S.-China trade war. Now, you may know that earlier this year, the U.S. Treasury and the State Bank of Vietnam reached an agreement in which basically they agreed that on the Vietnamese side, they agreed that we're going to let the value of the Vietnam dong appreciate. And in exchange for that, basically no tariffs on exports from Vietnam to the U.S. If you look at all the metrics of Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. and other things that the U.S. Treasury looks at, I mean, we really check every box for being considered a currency manipulator. I'm not saying we are, but we certainly check all the boxes. And so, if the U.S. government wanted to impose tariffs on Vietnam, they would certainly be, within the justification to do that. And the reason why they're not going to do that, you can see on the right hand of this screen it's right hand of the slide that I have up on the screen. This is something not a lot of people know about, but anyone that has any interest in Vietnam should really look into this topic a little bit more. This is a paper by the Atlantic Council, which is a very influential think tank in Washington, D.C., that was published just before the Biden inauguration at the beginning of this year. And basically, they're laying out a strategy which says, hey, the U.S. should really try to make friends with countries like Vietnam and Southeast Asia. We should really try to, promote the economic benefit and development. And that's why you see that even though Vietnam has one of the biggest trade surpluses with the U.S., they're not going to impose tariffs or do anything like that. So this is a very important point. And what they're doing is they're really opening the door, and they're telling multinationals around the world, you're safe to set up your factory in Vietnam. We're not going to get hit with tariffs. So the government is really encouraging that. So you always want to do things when you have the government especially you may know that the U.S. is Vietnam's biggest export market. So you want your biggest customer to say, hey, I'm happy to buy more and more stuff from you. Another dynamic, which I'll talk about just very briefly, and you can ask me more about this in the Q&A if you want, is that, long story short, both Korea and Japan face a situation which is called secular stagnation. And I have a lot of complicated details about this on the screen here, but the key is that both of those countries must, it's not like they would like to, they must move more and more of their production outside of their countries. And so Vietnam is kind of the most obvious place for them to move their production to. And that's because of the secular stagnation in both countries. And I could get into it more in the detail in the Q&A if people are interested. Another really important topic related to all this is that you're just starting to see now multinational firms helping to build out local supply chains in Vietnam. Multinationals, and this is the same thing that they did in Thailand and Mexico in the 1980s, Singapore in the 1990s, Singapore in the 1980s. So multinational firms, right now, Vietnam imports a lot of the parts and components. We use the cheap labor here to assemble them and then, send them off to the final sellers. But what you're starting to see is a build out of local industry to supply those FDI companies. The first big example of this is Apple Computer, which they've gone to an extraordinary effort to help some local firms that are suppliers. And then I have a slide here, which when you see this slide, your initial reaction, well, let me just show it to you. So the first batch of these AirPod headphones that are getting made by local suppliers in Vietnam, it appears that the quality was not so great, which can happen, when you're in the teething stage. Now, when you see that headline, you might think, oh, well, that doesn't sound like very good news, but it actually is good news because I've circled something from the article here where you see that basically Apple really engaged with those local Vietnamese suppliers to help them improve their quality right away. So it shows that they're really focused on getting more of their production here and getting more of the products built by local suppliers. Okay, as I come to the end, towards the end of my comments, I want to address directly all these negative headlines that we saw especially during the Delta variant outbreak, when a lot of factories were closed and there was a lot of concern about this. If you look into the details of all these articles that were in the international press about, factories in Vietnam are shut and maybe the factories are going to move back to China or, go to another country or something like that. If you look into the details of these articles, I promise you, you will not find one company mentioned that is saying, hey, we're going to move our electronics production from Vietnam to Pakistan or Bangladesh. It's not going to happen. So this topic, in fact, what is happening is that, and we have really in real time, still these high-tech companies are, and this is literally headlines from like within the last couple of weeks. So the high-tech manufacturers are still moving more and more production here. And this is a version of, there was a famous economist, Joseph Schumpeter, and Schumpeter had this idea called creative destruction, which basically means that, for an economy to sort of move up over time, you sort of lose the lower value added things over time, and then you go to the higher and higher value added things. And this is what's happening with Vietnam's FDI. If you look at all the registrations right now, it's all driven by high-tech electronics, things of this nature. The very last comment I want to make, again, related to the COVID topic, is that it has happened over and over in economic history. I mean, throughout time, but also in recent years, as you can see on the slide here, that when countries face a really severe crisis, they can use that crisis as an opportunity to make structural reforms, make improvements that actually make the growth of the country stronger going forward. And the example I like the most on this slide I've highlighted is Japan in 1973, when they faced this terrible oil shock. Japanese industry at that time, the Japanese growth miracle was in full bloom. The Japanese economy was going in a particular direction. Boom, they had this terrible crisis. They shifted directions and they made a bunch of changes that then laid the foundation for strong growth for the next 20 years. One of the reasons that I'm very confident that this is going to happen in Vietnam is just purely coincidentally, where we, Vienna Capital, myself in particular, one of the people that the government and the prime minister has solicited ideas about, what are things that we should do to change to encourage more FDI going forward. It's actually something I happen to be working on right now at the moment. So for that reason, and also looking back at this history of how crisis has played out in other countries in the past, I think the overall economic story here is much, much brighter than most people realize. And that's everything that I wanted to say today. And I guess we'll get back to the Q&A at the end. So, okay, thank you for your time and thank you for watching my presentation.